Welcome to this new automotive news video, the first of this new week, April 13th, 2026. And today, we're going to talk about the French government wanting to force you to switch to electric cars before 2030. We'll talk a little bit about how they plan to do it. We're also discussing Stellantis, which is announcing major layoffs at its Opel brand. As we'll see, their strategy is becoming increasingly unclear. We're also discussing Geely, a Chinese brand slowly entering Europe. They're promoting a new electric car battery technology they've developed, which would allow charging times of less than 5 minutes. And finally, we'll talk about various news concerning the Volkswagen Group, which has just published its results for the first quarter of 2026 overall. The results are down, especially for some of its brands like Porsche, where electric cars are really turning out to be a total flop. Just before all that, I want to add a little clarification regarding some news I shared with you in a video. Last week, we talked about Volkswagen, which announced the end of its 3-cylinder engine to return to larger displacement 4-cylinder engines, considered to be more reliable. We finally learned this weekend that the future of the 3-cylinder TSI wasn't fully settled yet, and that Volkswagen was leaving itself the option to continue using this engine, but only on small, lightweight cars, and to stop offering this engine on less aerodynamic and heavier SUVs. We'll now cover the topics we listed at the start of this video, which I hope interest you. If so, please show your support as always by leaving a like, subscribing for future videos, and especially boosting this one. That's really the most important thing. If you want to give my channel a little boost in terms of visibility, leave a quick comment sharing your thoughts on today's news. As I mentioned, we'll discuss a piece of news that caused a stir. This weekend, the Layoffs government, the French government, announced new electrification goals. So this affects pretty much all aspects of daily life for the French people, but of course, it also concerns the automotive sector. The current government wants 2/3 of new cars sold in France to be fully electric by 2030. The goal, according to our Prime Minister, is to reduce France's dependence on fossil fuels, which are sometimes sold by the United States, sometimes by India, sometimes by Russia. Why not? It's an argument that makes sense, but we shouldn't forget that right now, more than 8 out of 10 electric cars sold in Europe have Chinese batteries. And China has an almost complete monopoly over the entire production chain of those batteries. So here it's more about shifting our dependence rather than ending it. In any case, to try to reach this particularly ambitious goal, since we should remember that the Court of Auditors announced a few days ago that France would be unable to reach its target of 40% electric cars by the end of 2027. The Layoffs government will increase aid and subsidies, especially subsidies for buying electric cars. With a new subsidized leasing program, social leasing will be back starting in June 2026. And this time, there will be 100,000 applications that can be accepted. 50,000 will be reserved for low-income households, as was the case in 2025, but also 50,000 for professionals who are considered highly dependent on their vehicles. High-mileage drivers, such as nurses, home care workers, and craftsmen. We don't yet know the amount of assistance for standard subsidized leasing program, but what we do know is that for high-mileage drivers, this assistance can go up to 9,500 euros. And to qualify for this subsidized leasing program for high-mileage drivers, you'll need to earn less than 2,000 euros per month. There will also be assistance that can go up to 100,000 euros per company for those who would like to convert some of their commercial vehicles or trucks to 100% electric. The French government also wants the production of French electric cars to go from 400,000 units in 2027 to 1 million in 2030, a goal that still seems particularly difficult to achieve, since in recent months there have been more and more relocation plans. And obviously, France is not at all among the most attractive countries. For brands looking to have their EVs built, even Renault, 15% owned by the French state, has said it will move some EV production to Spain. And most of the brands that are sold in Europe have their production either in Spain, Hungary, Slovakia, Morocco, Turkey, or China. So unless there is an industrial shock, it's hard to imagine how that could happen. Unless there is a massive drop in the price per kilowatt hour, in energy prices in general, and in labor costs, which doesn't seem to be in the current government's plans. Renault and Stellantis welcomed these announcements. Obviously, they're not going to complain about getting a little help from the government to try to sell the electric cars that have been sitting unsold for months, especially from the Stellantis group. We'll see how it goes. To achieve these goals, France's entire automotive industry must be completely overhauled, as we're currently behind in almost every area. The development of batteries in general is led by China, and we'll talk more about that later in this video as they're ahead of everyone else. As for electric motors, we often use Chinese motors. Even Renault, on its so-called Made in France cars, uses Chinese motors. Battery production isn't top-notch here either. Everyone, including top industry players, is struggling to increase production. Charging infrastructure, even though it's sufficiently available on highways, is still missing from most villages and medium-sized towns. Manufacturers are still struggling to offer affordable electric vehicles as versatile as their combustion engine counterparts. And then, there's still a major underlying problem. The price of electricity has only been increasing in recent years. Maybe the government should start there if it wants to speed up the electrification of the car fleet, drastically reduce the price per kilowatt hour, and do so over the long term. As I was saying, it's often the Chinese brands that are ahead of the rest of the world when it comes to battery technologies. A few weeks ago, it was BYD that made a lot of noise by talking about its Blade 2.0 batteries and its ultra-fast 1,500 kW charging system. This time, it's Geely, a Chinese brand, that's making headlines with its new Golden Brick battery, a battery that supports a maximum charging power that's a bit lower than BYD's. It's a 1,000 kW peak here, but with a higher average charging speed, which is important to consider. Be careful when buying an electric car. Just because there are peaks at 500 kWh doesn't mean charging always happens at 500 kWh. Here, Geely focused more on the average charging speed than on pure peak charging power. As a result, with its new Golden Brick battery on, for example, the Lynk & Co 10 Plus, thanks to a 900V architecture, this 95 kW battery can recharge from 10 to 70% in just 4 minutes, and from 10 to almost 100% in just under 9 minutes. So, that's it. Charging times are now approaching those of refueling a gas-powered car. However, there's still something to mention. For now, all these ultra-fast charging speeds are completely dependent on the charging network. Even though in China, charging infrastructure sometimes allows for 1,000 or 1,500 kWh in France and more broadly in Europe, that's still science fiction. We're starting to see charging stations appear with 600 kWh, but that's clearly not the most common. It's very rare to find more than 350 kWh. In reality, even if this battery arrives in France as soon as tomorrow, there's still a good chance that to charge it, you'll need 2, 3, maybe even 4 times more time than what Geely is announcing here. To finish, I wanted to talk about some news concerning the group, the Volkswagen Group. In fact, the group just published its results for the first quarter of 2026. It's fair to say it's not a great year for them so far, though the Volkswagen Group is holding up in Europe. On a global scale, sales dropped by 4% mainly because of the Chinese and American markets. In China, it's down by 15%. That's a huge drop, which is easily explained by the fact that the Chinese are so far ahead when it comes to electric vehicles. It's extremely complicated for Volkswagen to compete with local competitors who offer better electric cars, often sold at much lower prices. And in the United States, the drop is even more severe, down by 20.5%. That's due to 2 things. First, Americans are hardly buying electric cars anymore since there are no more subsidies to buy them. Volkswagen had to quickly convert a local ID4 electric car factory to produce combustion engine cars instead. But also because a large part of the models that Volkswagen sells in the United States are models that are made in Europe. And, as you know, in the United States, there are high taxes on cars that are made in Europe. Ultimately, it's too costly versus local competitors, making it impossible for Volkswagen to sell cars. Among all the brands in the Volkswagen Group, there is still one for which things are particularly complicated right now, and that's Porsche. Porsche saw its global sales drop by 15% in the first quarter of 2026 with 60,000 units. This is due to 2 things. First, it's extremely dependent on the American market. Out of those 60,000 units, 18,000 were sold in the United States, so more than a quarter. And as I mentioned, the United States is no longer buying electric cars. So, when Porsche stopped producing some combustion engine models and rushed into electric cars, it ended up alienating its main market in just a few months. By the way, since we're talking about electric Porsches, you should know that only 18% of the cars sold by Porsche in this first quarter of 2026 were electric. That's 4 points less than what Porsche managed to achieve over the whole of 2025, and 7 points less than what it achieved in the first quarter of 2025 a year earlier. Let me give you a few more figures about this situation, which is actually quite alarming. For example, Porsche only sold 3,000 Taycans, which is 4 times less than what it sold in the last quarter of 2023. And that wasn't so long ago. And the 100% electric Macan, which, for example, is the only choice available if you want to buy a Macan in Europe, sold only 8,000 units. That's almost half as many as the sales of the electric Macan in the first quarter of 2025. At the same time, Porsche saw the sales of its gasoline Macan increase sharply again to more than 10,000 units. And above all, its 911 with a combustion engine sold 22% more than last year during the same period, with 13,000 units. Speaking of German brands, I also wanted to quickly talk to you about Opel, which now has absolutely nothing German about it anymore, since it belongs to Stellantis. Stellantis announced that 650 engineering positions will be cut at Opel's German sites. That's about a third of the engineers remaining in Germany for this brand. Since PSA and later Stellantis bought the brand in 2017, the number of engineers dropped from about 8,000 to just over 1,000 in 8 years, a reduction by a factor of 8. No official reason has been announced. However, we know that a few days ago, Stellantis formed a partnership with the Chinese brand Leapmotor to co-develop some new Opel models. So there's no point for Opel to have engineers anymore if, in the end, they're no longer the ones designing their future cars. And above all, it raises questions about Stellantis' overall strategy. Because for several weeks now, we've been hearing that Stellantis wants to improve the quality of its vehicles. And for that, they're planning to hire 2,000 engineers. What's the point of hiring 2,000 people if it's to lay off 800, 1,000, 2,500, or even more? That's it for today's news. The week is off to a very strong start in terms of automotive news. I hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, I'm counting on you to show your support, as usual, by leaving a like, subscribing for upcoming videos, and possibly supporting the channel by clicking the join button below. I'll see you tomorrow for the next one. Bye.